So I feel like I benefit a great deal from having heard some of the other wonderful talks that happened here today. There are quite a few bombs dropped here, one of which was from Siva when he said that Facebook cannot be fixed, that the time for that might have been 10 years ago, but the die is cast. So in my talk, I'm going to talk about some strategies that Facebook in particular has started to employ to imply that they might have a fix for their problems with data thievery, default capture, misinformation, and all of that. And I'm going to do it by way of looking at women of color's labor as part of the supply chain that makes digital media possible. And I mean that in a kind of literal way. So we would not have cell phones, we would not have computers, we would not have anything that could send or receive data signals if we didn't have devices we could buy. And we wouldn't have devices we could buy if it weren't for basically Asian women making them for us for very little money. So when we talk about infrastructure, it's really women of color all the way down. Their labor is absolutely instrumental to everything that we're talking about today. And as was mentioned, work on moderation, as well as work on assembly, work on other kinds of things like content production. I think it's really important. So in my larger project, I'm interested in how it is that now we know the day of reckoning is upon us. It seems to have taken a long time. As others have said, a lot of us have been talking about this for a long time. But now it's out there in the open. And what's more, it's been given a date and a time, 2018. So what happened in 2018? Well, Web 1.0 was a moment of idealism, enthusiasm, and above all, license for digital industries which were largely unregulated. It was part and parcel of the routine harassment of women and people of color, which were viewed not even as collateral damage, but not really as damage, right? The lack of regulation was, in fact, a feature, not a bug. It was the inevitable price of innovation, so move fast and break things. Today, these industries are really viewed as callous, self-interested, and invasive. They produce platform capitalism, which some wonderful scholars, such as Jeff, have written on. And we're in a moment of retrenchment where people are calling to break up things like Facebook. So we're in a bad moment when even TechCrunch and O'Reilly are turning on big tech. So TechCrunch writes, 2018 was the year that the long-held belief that Silicon Valley is on the right side was called into question. TechCrunch is, the kind of paradigmatic incubator for digital media startups. And O'Reilly, which is where the first quote came from, is another classic first-gen kind of industry, right? They wrote all the O'Reilly books. And they say the future we want to live in, or we can build a nightmare. The choice is up to us. So I was very inspired by Sarah Sharma's workshop, where she talked about the manifesto of the broken machine and feminist determinism, because the idea that we can design our way out of this problem, that we can patch it, that we can fix it, that we can find a new set of categories, a new set of menus, a new kind of protocol, really isn't going to work here, right? Because this is absolutely kind of baked into everything. So hence, VR. So let me talk a little bit more about what else happened in 2018. This is just one of the many things that Facebook has been dealing with, and I think the sad thing about it is that $5 billion just isn't that much money to Facebook, right? This isn't asking for very much in the way of change for them. So what do ethics and AI and empathy in VR have in common? You might have seen quite a few workshops on ethics and AI. It's like peanut butter and jelly, ethics and AI. And empathy and VR are the other sandwich, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Because it's often said that we want to educate programmers to not build things that can't be fixed, right? Not create software that, has effects that do exclude and exacerbate inequalities, that we really need them to regulate themselves. Right, that they need the right kinds of feelings. So I'm going to be talking about feelings today. They need to have ethics, and they need to have empathy. So this was also a year the year before 2018, the year supposedly everything kind of lost its moral compass. This was the year that Mark Zuckerberg proclaimed one of the most powerful features of VR is empathy. And it's kind of funny because we don't think of Mark Zuckerberg as being the most empathetic guy. He doesn't have a very emotive way about him, but also the way he runs Facebook, the way he thinks about the social consequences, the way he holds it so closely so that he's the one who's basically in control, seems to be a real failure of empathy. Hence Facebook's desire to acquire Oculus Rift, which, in line with the desire to move Facebook towards more privacy, more ephemerality, and more sensitivity, is part of a solution, which I would claim is kind of a reprisal of the problem. So this new kind of VR is really different from VR we had in the 90s, because this kind of VR, which they call VR 2.0, really takes its force not from the idea it can bring you somewhere else, or that you can learn something new, say how a bathroom should be designed, or what a daycare center looks like from the point of view of a child, or what a gorilla's point of view is, but that it does something much more important and much more needed in 2018, which is to fix racism. So, this VR is called the Ultimate Empathy Machine, and Chris Milk gave a very popular TED Talk. Chris Milk, you might also know, is a producer for the really kind of text in what I'm calling virtuous virtual reality, or VR for empathy, Clouds Over Sidra, which is about a girl named Sidra living in a Lebanese refugee camp, and her experiences after having had to flee this. So the New York Times sent out its Google Glass, the Google Cardboard. Did anybody get the Google Cardboard with the newspaper? Did you keep it or throw it away? I think I heard both. I threw it away immediately. But first I did look at some of the content, and they rolled it out with a new series on refugees. So the proper subject of virtual reality: refugees, people of color, victims of sexual harassment, transgender people, disabled people. In other words, all the people that Fred Moten and Stefano Harney call the undercommons. So when I think about the labor of people who are often excluded from the profits that come from the Silicon Valley industries, which are very closely held, it is people of color all the way down, right? So I'm going to be showing you some examples of how this idea of VR as a racial empathy machine is, again, leveraging the privacy, the bodies, and the labor of those people who are unable to assert their own rights to those things. For example, if you make a title like My Beautiful Home, which was produced by a VR studio called Pathos, which is supposedly meant to produce emotions, good feelings, empathy for refugees, people of color, global youth, and so on. The claim that they make in that video is that you can be in the favela. So it's like a favela tour. But you may know from having seen these favela tours, people are denied privacy in favelas. So if you do a virtual reality camera capture in there, you're basically looking at people's homes, right? You're in their space because they don't have their own personal space. So this is a big issue in terms of, morality, ethics, privacy, and those kinds of things. Facebook has never been good at that kind of stuff in particular. So why is it that we need virtual reality to do new work in 2018, right, or post-2018? In 1999, Bolter and Grusin wrote a wonderful book, Remediations, which those of us who taught in those periods remember as being the best thing there was. So what they had to say about empathy, and they had a whole chapter on virtual reality, which was amazing because there really wasn't much. It was somewhat notional at that time, but a whole chapter on VR, that part of the learning and the empathy you can get through VR is about experiencing the non-human through virtual re-embodiment. So as they wrote, quote, through empathy, the user is supposed to be able to, quote, learn what it is like to be a gorilla, a dinosaur, or a molecule. So even in those days, virtual reality was supposed to be the mediumless medium, right? I call this toxic re-embodiment, right, when it claims to put you in the body of somebody who may not even own their own body. So Mark Zuckerberg says VR's most powerful feature is empathy, but he did this right after a public apology he had to publish on Facebook when he broadcast images of himself using VR in Puerto Rico, superimposed over floods, people's houses being destroyed, debris flowing through the neighborhood. So you might have seen this one where he's high-fiving another employee, and people were just appalled at how he could be so insensitive. So this was a kind of anti-demo for virtual reality. Rather than showcasing the desirable features of the new platform, it demonstrated what unempathetic virtual presence looks like. It was both an extension of disaster tourism and a moment that embodied social media's problems. So this virtual image encapsulated big tech's lack of empathy for suffering, specifically people of color suffering. So the new VR 2.0, is so much like the early internet. The equipment's expensive, the developers are all men pretty much, most of the users are men, porn is the killer application, it's not that widespread. And like other digital media, it embodies the perpetual newness of new media. It's the oldest new medium I can think of, actually. It's a disturbing and enticing promise that we remember from the early internet, but which we can't have anymore. I think that's why it's so attractive. We have to give up on this idea of spaces of exception, lack of accountability, lack of regulation. With VR, we can have that again. We can have no rules. So this is a pretty typical pronouncement about VR, so I'll let you look at it in a minute. So I'm really interested in the yay here. There are no rules, yay. This is a horizon defined by futurity, not sustainability. The only rules here are protocols rather than accountability. The idea that this is both VR's worst and best thing embody the problems and the promise of digital media since the 90s. So understanding VR as an empathy machine puts this device to work as a curative to circumvent cruel or indifferent thoughts about already immiserated people and replaces them with innate or intense sensory experiences that invokes feelings of presence. So again, like older digital media. This kind of work, the work of creating empathy or engineering feelings for people you don't give a crap about, I'm calling this automating empathy, and I'm thinking very much of Virginia Eubanks' wonderful work, Automating Inequality, which is how digital tools exacerbate oppression, kind of invisibly by regulating homeless people, parents of sick and disabled children, and others entitled to resources, so they can be denied resources without a human face, right, with no appeal. So these are new forms of unfair decision-making that really don't even look like decisions because there's no person involved. Again, the ethics and AI problem. So anti-racist documentary virtual reality, which is what I'm talking about here, often employs people of color, sometimes animals, but mostly refugees. Really, refugees are the gold standard here with this kind of documentary virtual reality, frame absolution as information. In an age of fake news, when reporting about the Sandy Hook shootings are understood as a hoax by many people because of social media, no one is sure what the truth is. Virtual reality fills a very specific niche. It's the medium that not only needs to be felt to be believed, but cannot be doubted once it is felt. For the modality of VR is not cognitive and not hermeneutic, but rather visceral. And as Vach writes, the CEO of Pathos, and he has a great story about how he started Pathos because he saw Chris Milk's Clouds Over Sidra and started crying. And there's so many stories of people crying when watching VR. They love to put these up on YouTube. So Gina Rodriguez is shown crying looking at Homeless in LA, which is one of Nani de la Peña's famous videos from kind of earlier days. And presumably she walks out into the street in LA where there are tons of homeless people, right? But nonetheless, it's the proof of concept for what makes this a good technology. So Vach writes that he considers himself not an artist and not a filmmaker or not a developer, but an engineer. He views a medium as a device for producing specific kinds of feelings or engineering feelings like compassion, sympathy, and especially tears. So that black teenagers are often not believed when reporting police violence, that a celebrity would cry while viewing these VR titles about homelessness but walk by those exact people, mirrors a larger turn to data-driven representation and decision-making that contribute materially to the production of the undercommons, right? The idea you cannot trust people when they speak their own truth or describe their own suffering. Rather, you need to experience it for yourself to know it is true. Feeling good about feeling bad is a pleasure specific to VR. Seeing as a refugee, as a black man living in the Jim Crow South, as a death row prisoner, and these are all titles I've taught in my VR class, let the user have it both ways, immersed in virtue as well as pleasurable pain. Making racial empathy pleasurable puts the undercommons to work making empathy content because they're recorded experiences, and I put this in quotes. The VR industry likes to call what they make experiences, but IMDb just calls them films. Right? And they're screened at film festivals. They're really not experiences, but I think packaging them this way is another way to say the solution to all of our social problems is internal. If you can feel the right feelings or cry the right kinds of tears, we don't need to regulate anything, right? Regulate the industry, regulate society, because we will automatically do the right thing on our own, right? We'll feel the pity, we'll feel the suffering, and we will do it. So this is not by any means new. Media have always used representations of suffering to create identity, immersion, identification, empathy. However, VR for social good claims to give a certain experience which they hold over and above other kinds. So this is not an atypical kind of enterprise here. In fact, this was never made. Like a lot of VR titles, it's actually an idea and not an actual media experience. Or thing you can look at. So this claims to put you in the body of a wheelchair user suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. This was never made, but the idea for such a game, the idea that it would reproduce a specific stigmatized identity, a transgendered person with disabilities, was just catnip to journalists. They saw this as a stellar example of how empathetic VR is. And here's another example. This is from Nani de la Peña's One Dark Night, which I was going to screen, but I really couldn't because it was way too traumatizing. It uses actual documentary audio of a shooting, of Trayvon Martin's shooting. And you, as the user, are sitting in an apartment as a witness listening to this and listening to the ambulance and all the actual ambient sounds. So this is identity tourism for the 21st century, but with a difference. This time, the kinds of bodies that are on offer are not just racialized, exotic others that you can recreationally and temporarily use. Instead, these are about embodying as a refugee or other object of pathos that invite you to be with, instead of as, though sometimes as, within virtual spaces that you can navigate at will. So I think Nani de la Peña's One Dark Night is a very well-meaning title, but that suffers from the same kind of problems around virtuous embodiment that these titles all have, which is that they reproduce racial violence in the name of reducing it. But the shooting doesn't happen in the same space as the viewer. The real-life audio of screaming makes it clear where you are and what is being simulated. So VR developers like Pathos, Oculus, within and other producers of documentary VR claim to put you in the shoes of non-white and threatened bodies. And, I think as Wendy said, if something says it's going to put you in the shoes of somebody or something, that means that they've stolen those person's shoes, right? So, but that's still the dominant and kind of the gold standard, right? Do you feel like you own that body? And the term that social psychologists use is body transfer. Right? If you actually flinch when something comes towards you or you have a kind of physiological reaction, well, in VR, it means that you transferred or claimed that body. And Saidiya Hartman's work, I think, on spectacular suffering and why it is that reading slave narrative is so pleasurable for white people, right? But has a very different effect on non-white people, has really a lot to tell us about why it feels so good to feel so bad. Right? And why it's so necessary to be in the body to understand or to believe that this kind of suffering is actually happening. And I know that it parallels a cultural shift that we have, that Siva and others talked about, towards overt forms of racism, xenophobia, and misogyny. So this is seen as a very, kind of efficient and effective fix for those kinds of problems. So rather than dealing with feelings of empathy, sadness, and fear that we experience as a form of precarious social and institutional positionality in digital culture, instead, what this kind of VR does is to try and produce empathy and compassion for unfree and marginalized humans, the incarcerated, people of color, refugees, and in some cases, ourselves, right? Some of us are in those categories. And I wanted to mention as well, the earliest VR was kind of developed to train soldiers how to kill people, and then developed to train people how to not have too much PTSD after killing those people. So it's kind of a circuit in the military-industrial complex. So here's a pretty typical, again, quote about what VR developers think they're doing. So as he says, I started with a hypothesis, which was that by using virtual reality, you can hack your body into becoming more empathetic. So this is not an appeal to the mind, or even really to, morals or ethics or empathy. It's really about tricking your body into doing something that it's not otherwise going to do. So I see these as other kinds of a piece with Soylent Green, right? It's an optimization or focus technology for people who are too busy to do the real thing. So instead of having real food, you have this protein drink, which will kind of keep you going and keep you on track. And instead of actually engaging with people who are suffering or acknowledging even your own suffering, you can do this 10-minute VR experience, which will automate that for you. So, okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about emotional labor now and what I'm calling the third industrial revolution. So I'm really glad that Norbert Wiener came up because I think he's a really crucial figure. Fred Turner talked about him. So if we want to decolonize virtual reality or do something to stop this automation of feeling, there are some things we should take account of. How it is that this automation of empathy is of a piece with what Norbert Wiener called the first and second industrial revolutions. So in 1950, he wrote that computing has a Janus face. Well, on the one hand, it replaces the tedious labor of calculation. No one should have to do 10 key all day long, right? And no one should have to dig ditches all day long or pump water out of mines all day long, something he noted that mostly slaves had to do in silver mines in Brazil. So he's thinking specifically about how really robots and automation reproduce slave labor, not just labor, but compelled labor, slave labor, and racialized labor. He really wanted to hold a special place for what he called judgment. So human beings don't have to add numbers, it's not important to them. But judgment should not be outsourced to machines. So he was super worried about the atomic bomb. Right? He didn't want that to get launched without people having something to say about it. And he was super worried about the end of work. So another reason why people are interested in him again. So he sees the steam engine as a great humanitarian leap forward because it replaced the most brutal forms of human or animal labor, the labor of human slaves, with machine labor. Now we can replace service labor. Or other kinds of cognitive labor, Amazon, Google, and so on, often labor that women have done and labor that's been racialized, cooking, delivering food, cleaning up food, and so on. So what's left after physical labor has been replaced by steam engines and cognitive and service labor has been replaced by AI? What kind of labor is left? What's left that humans need that machines can't yet do? So internet toxicity is often figured as a problem best solved by individual transformation or revelation, empathy or ethics, rather than regulation or policy. Again, we can't regulate this. I think it was pretty clear from earlier speakers. But this appeal to ethics and empathy is a way to say if we could just make the industry more compassionate, they could be trusted to regulate themselves, right? VR's claims to produce empathy frame racism and toxicity as a problem with a head-mounted solution, rather than as a set of structural relations that require structural solutions. So I see VR as a harbinger of the third industrial age, because it seems to address the problem of the second industrial age, which is the immiseration of humans as machines take our jobs, by making available the last kind of work that machines can't do, which is to create feelings, specifically the right kind of feelings. So empathy and compassion are perceived as valuable and fundamental, as Lauren Berlant has said, because they take the place of the promise of progress or rights or resources. The sufferings of refugees, people of color, women, the disabled, and other not-white men, proxied in VR, seek to automate humane recognition. So interestingly, I find people like Berlant and Norbert Wiener much more useful to talk about VR than a lot of people who are talking about VR, I think, because they're really excited about the difference, like how much more real it is and how much more fancy it is and how much better it works than what used to work before. But in the end, the claims are very the same, right? Which is that compassion is something you can make, right? This is the third industrial revolution. You can tell your body when to cry, right? That's what it's supposed to do. So it automates the labor of feeling pain and sadness on behalf of another. It takes empathy into the realm of non-human virtual witnessing and connection, or non-virtual witnessing and connection. So I want to end by talking about a couple projects that I think are really, really important in terms of what VR is for, what we should be doing with it, how we should view it. If we take empathy out of the picture as VR's claim to exceptionality, what do we have here, right? Donna Haraway, I think, is completely right to say that we can't expect to have agency around these things. The third industrial revolution already automated our feelings, whether we like it or not, right? But what you can have is responsibility for your role within it. That's not fun. You know, responsibility doesn't sound that fun. But as Black feminist theorists have known for some time, the desire to experience empathy for the sufferings of Black people while leaving structural racism in place has long underwritten pleasurable kinds of cultural appropriation and projection. So responsibility doesn't offer that kind of pleasure. In the age of VR, it forces users to forgo automated empathy for racialized others, replacing it with something far more rigorous and more meaningful. And in any event, philosophers are kind of against empathy nowadays, right? Alan Bloom has a book called Against Empathy, saying it's much better for somebody motivated by cold logic and reasoning to provide material help to somebody than for someone to shed a tear and move on, right? He's not that interested in it. So how do we get away from the idea of VR as a way to get people to do things they might not otherwise do? How do we get them to do things they might not otherwise do? Redress material inequalities and precarity, especially for people of color, women, et cetera, instead of feeling something they might not otherwise feel. VR is addictive by design. And I want to end by looking at the work of Hyphen Labs. They're a woman of color design collective. And they produced a really interesting piece you can get on the Oculus store called Neurospeculative Afrofuturism. And you sit in a beauty salon and you get your hair done, and you kind of interact with people and they talk to you, and then you look in the mirror and it's over. It's not very long. But even the BBC really kind of jumped to the empathy machine conclusion here by saying that this turns you into a Black woman, which is certainly not the intention of this piece. It's not even what it's trying to do. But the novelty of Black women at all in VR was so great, they just lost their minds, right? They just couldn't handle it. And so it's described as an experience populated exclusively by Black women, as if every other VR title weren't populated exclusively by white people, right? Like, unless you're talking about refugees and slavery and the civil rights movement. So if we want to decolonize VR, I think we need to look at how to give resources to communities to produce VR that don't have it now. So indigenous communities, women's groups, youth, I think that would really make a big difference. And I also want to acknowledge the work of Skawanati, who has done some work on VR from an indigenous perspective, and there are other people doing this work too. So I want to end by talking about how the digital industries have created radically precarious material conditions of life for the global majority. And these are really racialized crises. VR is the totem of the overdeveloped world, right? It really represents everything about that space in every way. So the desire to sense empathy in the body, to outsource this labor of compassion, is addicted by design. And while the pleasurable tears of empathy that VR produce may feel bad, but in a good way, Giving into these virtual feelings reproduces the circuits of trauma that engendered and perpetuated their use in other places like the military-industrial complex. So rather than trying to automate compassion for those who suffer as a result of this violence, we need forms of critique that show us how emotions like empathy and compassion have alibied untenable material conditions of labor for racialized and gendered people long before virtual reality ever got here. And I wanted to end with this because it's Audre Lorde, and it's just perfect for this kind of thing. The idea that you can have a private solution, right, an internal, empathic, or personal solution without ever having to deal with collective action or work with communities, I think is really something she was very against. So if we continue to believe that we can solve our empathy problems with machines, then we're probably not going to get anywhere with solving the problems we have with big tech today. Thank you.